and the work that we do. And I'm going to then pass the time to my colleague, Dr. Juwita. So welcome again to our Ideas online launch. We're very pleased this morning to launch this policy brief that our economics and business team have worked on relentlessly over the last few months. And first, I also would like to thank the Australian High Commission for having worked with us and supporting the Ideas team on a topic that is dear to both Malaysia and Australia's hearts. As we know, over the period of the pandemic, everything digital was made a highlight of national development. It was also during this period that the Malaysian government launched its My Digital Blueprint, which has been received well. However, only time will tell as to whether the implementation will be able to truly elevate Malaysia's economy forward and upward. However, whatever takes place, we also know that digital trade is essentially here to stay. The numbers speak for themselves, and some of these statistics will be shown to you later. So again, we look forward to exploring both the challenges as well as the opportunities for digital trade in Malaysia as we try to take that leap forward into the next decade of the economy and what that economy actually does require. So just a short word about Ideas from me. So Ideas is the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs. For those who are unfamiliar with us or have not yet interacted with us, we are an independent public policy think tank that has been in Malaysia for the last 12 years. We are a team of 25 and we work vociferously on a whole range of matters, including economics and business, through which our trade work, as you are seeing here today, is being fleshed out. We also have a social policy team where we look at education and healthcare policy, as well as democracy and governance, where we look at more political and institutional reforms that the country truly needs. And finally, in fiscal policy, where the public finance team takes a look at anything to do with budget transparency and anything to do with our public finances. So as you can see, Ideas is spread quite widely, but the main pillars are essentially looking at the institutions that will strengthen our step forwards for better socioeconomic outcomes for the country in the future. We do this by a range of things, having small roundtable discussions, public conferences and webinars such as this. And the idea is to stimulate critical discourse on the most important public policies that Malaysia truly needs for our society. We have also done work in the past on dealing with national unity and interracial harmony, another topic that we think is absolutely crucial for us to address. And we look forward to doing more of this as well. So I think I'm not going to take too much time. Thank you so much for joining all of us here on this lovely Thursday morning. And we also, on a final note, would like to state that whatever reports that Ideas emerges with, including this one, we very much look forward to channeling them forward to the new government of the day. And of course, despite the fact that we do not have yet the cabinet ministers in place, once they are appointed, we look forward to interacting closely with the relevant minister and to share the findings, the outputs, the discussions with regards to digital trade, as well as the regulatory environment within which all things digital should be operating. We look forward to further work in this area, and please continue to follow us on all of our platforms. Thank you so much. I would like to pass the time now to Dr. Juwita Mohamad, my colleague, our research director, as well as the Director of Economics and Business. And I wish all of you a very good discussion today, and I look forward to hearing from you thereafter. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Trisha. I would now like to invite Hannah Birdsey from the Australian High Commissioner's Office.
Thanks very much, Juita, and thank you very much to Ideas for inviting me to speak at the launch today of these research findings on strengthening the digital trade ecosystem in Malaysia. I'd like to particularly acknowledge Dr. Tricia Yeo, the CEO of Ideas Malaysia, all of our esteemed panel members, and say a warm welcome to all participants in today's seminar. And at the outset, I'd also like to express our appreciation for the great partnership that the Australian High Commission has had with Ideas, in fact, over a number of years. I think it's a strong partnership because Ideas and the Australian High Commission, we share a close interest in advancing a competitive economy, ensuring trust in institutions, and promoting an inclusive Malaysia. But we're particularly pleased to be partnering with Ideas on today's topic, strengthening the digital trade ecosystem, because we recognise the importance to our shared prosperity of the digital economy and digital trade. We have this shared experience of navigating the global COVID pandemic, and that underscored the importance of digital trade to our economies. And it also drove an increasingly large number of firms and consumers online. So in the last couple of years, we've seen a dramatic increase in commitments by industry and by governments to digitalise. And that ranges from the increasing shift to banking online, to digitalisation of government services like passport applications or tax returns. Digital trade and the technologies that underpin it is now fundamental to global economic growth. And when you consider that around a third of the global population has never used the internet, it's clear that there are these massive opportunities for growth of the global digital economy. So in response, both Australia and Malaysia have actually developed digital economy strategies to try and harness the economic benefits of this fourth industrial revolution, which we know is going to be characterised by automation, massive data exchange, cloud computing, and artificial intelligence. But the benefits of this digital economy can't be properly realised and can't be properly shared if there are behind the border barriers to online participation or other unjustified limits that prevent consumers and businesses from engaging in digital trade. So Australia is increasingly working together with partner countries in the region to try and shape an international environment that enables digital trade and reinforces a rules-based trading system in this space. A practical example, not in Malaysia, but in a close neighbour, is the Australia-Singapore Digital Economy Agreement, which entered into force in December of 2020. This agreement broke new ground for us. It set new benchmarks for digital trade rules to reduce barriers to digital trade and to build an environment where consumers and businesses are able to participate in and benefit from the digital economy. Another example, a little bit closer to home for Malaysia, is the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, more commonly known by its acronym, the CPTPP. This agreement includes breakthrough rules on digital trade that promote the free flow of data across borders as part of normal business activities. Governments that have committed to the CPTPP have agreed to regulate data flows in ways that do not create barriers to trade. They've committed to avoid localization requirements that would otherwise force businesses to build data storage centres or use local computing facilities within CPTPP markets. And this commitment is important because it provides certainty to businesses who are considering their investment choices as they digitalise. And so that's why Australia really welcomes the entry into force of the CPTPP for Malaysia just a couple of days ago, really a great achievement. This agreement is going to strengthen our trade and economic links between Australia and Malaysia, as well as other CPTPP members, and create a better enabling environment for trade and investment, including for digital trade, underpinned by harmonised rules and digital standards. These are all excellent outcomes for the digital economy and for the promotion of digital trade. So the research findings that are being presented today are therefore very timely. I do hope that the findings will be useful for policymakers that are trying to develop these best practice rules for regulating the digital economy and encouraging digital trade, including in key areas such as data protection and cybersecurity. So I'm looking forward to today's presentation and discussion and learning more about facilitating digital trade for Malaysia's benefit. And I'm sorry that I'm not going to be able to stay right through to the end, but I do look forward to the early presentations. And I thank Ideas for their work and for partnering with the Australian High Commission on this, this very important research. And we look forward to continuing to work with Ideas in the future. Thank you very much. Back to you, Dr. Juwita.
Thank you so much, Hannah. I'm so glad that you mentioned the DEA and also the CPTPP. On the DEA, we will be presenting on that topic in the presentation and also in the report. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, I am Juwita Muhammad. I'm the director of the Economics and Business Unit, and today with one of our co-writers, Farlina, I will be presenting to you the findings from our publication, from the policy report, which will be made available right after the launch. So as was mentioned before, the title of our policy report is called the Strengthening the Digital Trade Ecosystem, Looking at the Next Frontier of Growth for Malaysia. Next slide, please. So just a bit of a background, and this was already highlighted by Trisha as well by Hannah. The project actually aims to identify a few different aspects of the digital trade ecosystem. So the first one is actually our main focus was to identify the benefits as well as the challenges in strengthening the digital trade ecosystem in Malaysia, and how this ecosystem can then support further trade activities with existing partners like Australia and all of the other ASEAN plus partners, +1 partners, again, to secure a sustainable economic growth in the near future, and also to secure growth for the recovery from the COVID-19 in the medium to long term. So the project also aims to explore and examine the existing laws and also the newly introduced measures and policies related to digital trade in Malaysia, including regulations on digital taxes or taxing the digital economy, as well as on data localization, cybersecurity issues, among others. We were also, through this project, backed by literature review and also desktop analysis, we were able to engage with different stakeholders like businesses, investors, policymakers, as well as government agencies to gauge the extent of those challenges that will be mentioned later on the ground, and examine as well our international best practices when it comes to taxing the digital economy, as well as looking when we look at cybersecurity issues on data localization and also data transfer issues. So we also wanted to present policy recommendations on the factors needed to support the Malaysian digital trade activities within and beyond the country. And we will again be conducting an engagement session with relevant stakeholders, hopefully when we launch the report, even after the report deadline or the project timeline is over. So again, just as a footnote for everyone, the policy report here examines several areas when it comes to the digital economy, but we are actually focusing on the ICT as well as the e-commerce sectors. We're also looking, we also looked at obviously digital taxation frameworks, cross-border data flows, data protection, and also data privacy issues. So next slide, please. Next slide, please, Zudi. Thank you. So before we go into the findings, let me just try to explain to you the component of digital trade within the digital economy ecosystem. So this is obviously very much linked together. So the digital trade here can be defined as digitally enabled transaction of goods and services that can be delivered physically or digitally. So again, these transactions can include between and among consumers, firms, as well as government agencies. To be more specific, even though all types of digital trade are made possible by using digital technologies, not all forms of digital trade are actually delivered digitally. So again, this makes the whole transaction a bit more complicated when it comes to digital trade in the digital economy. For instance, we see that digital trade can involve a digitally enabled platforms, but the goods or services themselves can be physically delivered to the consumer. Some examples include purchasing a physical book through an online bookstore or booking a stay on Airbnb for an apartment in the city. Next slide, please. So just as a background of the digital economy here in Malaysia, according to the Department of Statistics, Malaysia's 2018 report, Malaysia's digital economy, which is made up of two components, the e-commerce and also the ICT sectors combined, was estimated to be valued at about 19% of the GDP. And there was a projection that if it wasn't for the lockdowns and the restrictions of movements, this share would reach up to 20% by the end of 2020. Looking at the recent available data, we have passed that threshold of 20%, whereby the new threshold is now at 23% of GDP. So you can see that the digital economy itself presents a huge potential as the next source of growth for the Malaysian economy. So looking at Malaysia and comparing it with different countries in terms of digitization, we see that Malaysia is one of the more digitized countries in the world. Looking at 2015 alone, we saw that about 70% of the households were already connected to the internet to a certain extent. This trend continued to grow as a year before the pandemic, we saw that about 90% of the Malaysian households did have access to the internet. Next slide, please. So when we look at one subsector of the digital economy in Malaysia, it is the ever-growing data center in Malaysia. Again, this goes back to the ICT subsector within the digital economy framework. The boom in the ICT sector within the digital economy ecosystem has been long fueled by the rapid expansion of data centers in Malaysia. According to a 2019 report by the firm called Cushman and Wakefield, the Southeast Asia region was projected to be the fastest growing region for co-location data centers over the next 5 years. And when we look at the compounded annual growth rate, this was estimated to be about 13% between 2019 to 2024. So looking at the rankings itself, Malaysia now ranks fourth, actually behind Singapore, Hong Kong, and also South Korea. The index here looks at the competitiveness of a country in the data center market in terms of factors such as the physical infrastructure, economic, and also social attributes like connectivity, ease of doing business, political stability, corporate tax rate, natural disasters, and as well energy security. So here within this report, we saw that the Malaysian data center market alone is estimated to expand by about 13% by 2024 from 2019. So next slide, please. So looking at such progress made on the ground, we saw that through our research that over the last 5 years, the Malaysian government has either introduced or proposed a series of taxes that directly or indirectly target the digital economy. So again, this is something that is relatively new for Malaysia, but we do see that there is a molding of some sort of framework when it comes to the digital taxing the digital economy. And of course, when we look at the taxation framework that is already here, the immediate justifications that were made for introducing and proposing such taxes have largely been about ensuring Malaysia's taxation framework to remain adequate for the digital economy, and most importantly, to provide a leveled playing field for local businesses when it comes to competition in the digital economy. Next slide, please. So when we look at the existing framework for taxing the digital economy, and again, because this is something relatively new for Malaysia, we did find that segregating it into direct and indirect taxation was beneficial for the study. So again, for the direct taxation, for example, there is one measure that has been implemented, and this is called the updated guidelines on taxation of electric commerce transactions, whereby when you see indirect taxation, it ranges from proposed to implemented, and for the proposed taxation measures, it would include service tax on goods, delivery services, and this is again, would this impact the logistic component of the digital trade. And when we look at the implemented indirect taxation, this also includes different forms of sales tax amendment bills, as well as service tax on digital services, and also the amendments on the tourism tax. Let me go to the next slide. Next slide, please. So looking at the indirect taxes first, we did see that in August 2022, the Dewan Rakyat passed the sales tax amendment bill, which seeks to impose a flat 10% sales tax on goods purchased online and delivered to Malaysia by vendors registered within the Finance Ministry. So again, this is something that was just introduced in 2022. And but when it comes to taxing the digital economy, during the pandemic, the government of Malaysia did introduce a service tax on digital services. And here it stipulates that a foreign service provider is required to pay services tax at the rate of 6% on the digital services that it provides to a consumer in Malaysia. So again, this is something that is relatively new as well. Here an FSP will only be subject to registration if their annual revenue from digital services exceeds a certain amount. So that threshold is actually 500,000 ringgit. Next slide, please. So on the indirect taxes, as mentioned before, this is something that is already existing. We have the service tax on goods delivery service. So again, this was proposed for the taxation framework to expand the scope of service tax to also include goods delivery services, regardless of the status of the service providers. And this is something that was just introduced or was just proposed, but we still we're still waiting for the implementation or further details on implementation in the first quarter of next year. When it comes to the tourist tax, we found that in 2021, there was an introduction of a digital tax on accommodation premises reserved through digital platform service providers. And this is, again, something that is new. And this, again, impacts the digital economy indirectly when it comes to the tourism industry. So next slide, please. On the direct taxes, we found that there's one guideline on taxation of electric commerce transactions, and this was actually introduced before the pandemic. In 2019, IRB published its updated guidelines on taxation of electronic commerce transaction, replacing the earlier guidelines released way back in 2013. And here, the updates is in response to the evolvement of the e-commerce sector and also the development of new business models. So we do see that measures in terms of taxing the digital economy have been quite responsive to a certain extent. Next slide, please. But in general, we do see that there's a variety of concerns when it comes to taxing the digital economy, not just in Malaysia, but just in general as well, looking at the last few years, because again, this is something very new for many different countries. And again, it's a complicated task to be taxing the digital economy. So in our engagement with selected stakeholders in Malaysia, some have raised a variety of concerns about digital taxes already proposed or introduced in Malaysia over the last few years. And these are already backed by publicly available data and publicly available reports. So there was a statement or a sharing of confusion over definition and also double taxation. In the case of the recently amended sales tax, for example, there were concerns that was raised about whether the definition of seller may include both sellers on online marketplaces and the online marketplace operators themselves. Again, this would and may lead to the possibility of double taxation if both were decided to be targets of these sales taxes. So similar concerns were also raised about the digital service tax, especially if a business, a Malaysian business falls within the definition of digital services, as well as imported taxable services. So another concern that was raised was on the lack of transparency when it comes to the implementation and introduction of these new measures. There were concerns that have been raised by the private sector about how certain taxes have been implemented without adequate details and time to prepare accordingly. So again, in the case of the amended sales tax, businesses were given less than 5 months to implement or to adhere to the rules without relevant guidance and relevant rules being released in a timely manner. And of course, there were concerns on the increasing the cost of business. So stakeholders have also noted that the introduction of certain types of taxes may raise the cost of doing business in general. Beyond simply paying the taxes, the expansion of digital trade will also impact the greater requirements for tax reporting, for example. And much of this reporting burden will fall on intermediaries, even within the digital economy. And this goes back to smaller firms without the resources and without the capacity to address compliance concerns. Next slide, please. So when we did look at measures in the international arena, we did see that the OECD G20 inclusive framework on BEPS was established way back in 2016 by the OECD and the G20 to provide a forum for countries to participate on an equal footing in the development of standards on base erosion and profit shifting, so BEPS. So Malaysia is also one of the countries that have committed to the program. So the Inclusive Forum subsequently developed the twin pillar solutions to address the tax challenges arising from the digitalization of the economy. So again, it was introduced to tackle tax-related challenges related to the digital economy. So within this twin pillar, you see pillar 1 with members reallocating some taxing rights from an MSME's home country to the market jurisdictions where it has business activities and profits. In the other pillar, pillar 2, certain MSMEs will be subject to a minimum tax of 15%. So again, this goes back to the introduction of a global minimum corporate tax. It is hoped, again, this can put or set a leveled playing field for all players in the digital economy. Next slide, please. So again, looking at the digital economy and the challenges when it comes to taxing the digital economy, I cannot overemphasize how complicated this task is. There are several challenges that we did see from our research that is not just localized for the Malaysian context only, but in general, there are at least 4 important ways that the digital economy has affected traditional tax systems. Number 1, by allowing firms to compete in markets without a physical presence, by the proliferation of different approaches, mostly used by larger firms to manage tax, companies that can operate with or no minimal physical presence in a certain economy, and by the participation in, again, the cross-border trade by companies previously not engaged in such transactions. So I'm going to run through the challenges that we have touched upon in our report. So the first one, again, is the complexity of the nature of digital goods and services. How do you segregate them? How do you treat them in terms of taxing the 2 components if a certain product embodies these two forms of product line? Next slide, please. There's also the difficulty of collecting value-added tax on digital cross-border trade. And this is also because of anonymity and also difficulty in identifying companies in the digital economy who should be taxed, when should it be taxed in terms of the supply chain. This is, again, something that we touched on in our report. Again, looking at the general context, there seems to be a difficulty in domestic enforcement of the peer-to-peer economy. This goes back to how tax officials treat different types of workers, like gig economy workers. How should that be approached, as well as logistical issues and administrative capacity there. We see that there are many logistical challenges as the digital economy has increased cross-border movements of not just goods, but also people and services. And then these are also challenges that was highlighted by the ADB report of 2017. So again, in the case of Malaysia, tax revenues as a share of GDP was only measured at about less than 13% in 2018. And this is, again, one of the lowest in the region. So indeed, looking back at the announced 2023 budget, which focused on alleviating rising cost of living due to higher interest rates and also inflationary pressures, we do see that there is a need for Malaysia to broaden its tax base, and taxing the digital economy may be one of those new sources of income for the government in the medium to long term. So however challenging it is, it does pose a potential in new sources of income for the country as a developing country. Next slide, please. In our report, we did look at different ASEAN countries and how they are taxing the digital economy. So even countries from the CLMV buckets like Cambodia, they have introduced a sub decree 65, which requires VAT registration by non-resident, which are entitled with no physical presence in Cambodia. And this introduction came in 2021. And we did see that countries like Indonesia and Singapore and Thailand, who are also our peers, who have also introduced different measures on taxing the digital economy, even during the pandemic for Indonesia. So like Malaysia, these new measures are motivated by a desire to ensure that national taxation frameworks remain adequate for the digital economy, as well as to provide a level playing field for local businesses when it comes to competition from abroad. So next slide, please. I would like to invite one of the co-writers, Farlina, and the main writer for the cybersecurity component to take the floor and do her presentation. The floor is yours, Farlina.
Thank you so much, Dr. Juwita. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for actually taking the time out of a beautiful Thursday morning. Well, the sun is actually out to actually join us on this virtual forum. I suppose actually just discussing the cybersecurity environment, because if we are actually looking at cross-border trade, we would actually have to have a sufficient level of cybersecurity to ensure that all the users, regardless of where you may reside, some of the processes would actually be conducted to high levels of safety. So I think just going through some of the basic information, which is like the cybersecurity environments, as mentioned by Dr. Juwita, Malaysia is actually rapidly digitizing. We have actually some of this enshrined in various documents, such as the Malaysia Digital Economy Blueprint, the National Cybersecurity Strategy 2020 to 2024, the Defense White Paper, the National Policy on Science, Technology and Innovation 2021 to 2030, as well as a number of other innovation-related documents like the 1010 Malaysian Science, Technology, Innovation and Economy, or actually, I would just call it MySci framework. So in 2021, we actually find that more than 95% of individuals are online. This is actually perhaps due to the pandemic. Household computer access actually reached 88.3%. Household mobile access is actually at 99.6%, and individual internet access peaked at 96.8%. So through the years, Malaysia has always placed ICT as a priority. Malaysia was one of the first in the region to actually formulate a national cybersecurity policy in 2006. And the approach for cybersecurity is actually developed in tandem with economic ambition. So you can actually even trace this back to policies such as the 8th Malaysian Plan and the Multimedia Super Corridor policies. Malaysia's commitment to knowledge and economy actually perhaps bears fruit in some of Malaysia's global positioning in cyber, like the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Report actually places Malaysia 33rd out of 141 for ICT adoption, while other independently done rankings actually does place Malaysia well in cyber power. For instance, Belfer Center's National Cyber Power Index actually placed Malaysia 19th out of 30 countries for Malaysia's cyber capabilities. And the International Telecommunications Union placed Malaysia 5th in the list of cybersecurity index in 2020. So if it's okay for us to move to the next slide. So taking a look at cybersecurity incidences that happens in Malaysia. Perhaps the topmost, which is the topmost, which are actually looking at the reports by MyCert. Malaysia currently records approximately 10,000 cyber incidences, and this is perhaps in fraud, intrusion attempts, where in 2021 and 2019 there are around 7,098 and 7,774 incidences, respectively. Respectively for 2021, while in 2019, for intrusions, it's around 1,410 and 1,359 reports. This actually coincides with trends that is actually occurring in cybercrime, where you actually find in 2022, Trend Micro actually reported a 282% year-over-year increase for ransomware attacks. And Malaysia was actually seen as one of the places that was a recipient of it, even though some of the reports may actually not necessarily be reported in MyCert. The other types of cybersecurity incidences that there are actually in the system that we actually do see is in regards to high-profile data leakages. So in recent months, there have actually been concerns about vulnerabilities in data management. Around September 2021, there was a possible data breach of the National Registry Department, allegedly linked to the availability of a database containing personal information of 4 million Malaysians online. Close to a year later, the information of 22 million Malaysians were also allegedly linked to JPN is actually found for sale. This is interspersed with careless data management, such as those occurring at the public-private COVID-19 industrial immunization program, or known as PICAS, that was actually managed by MITI. Such incidences actually does raise concerns, and it actually does come in tandem with international trends for data breaches due to the availability of some of these services by criminals, as well as just the rapid digitization in this space. Lastly, some of the cybersecurity incidences that we actually do find is in regards to advanced persistent threats and strategic challenges. So Malaysia was actually featured in reports by the private sector associated with advanced persistent threats. And some of these are actually intended for information gathering purposes. And if we actually were to look it up, APT 30 and APT 40 that's actually related to South China Sea would actually be among the operations that's available. So just to move on to the next slide, some of these areas when we're actually looking at cybersecurity incidences and cyber operations, actually at the core of it, we will actually have to take a look at the data protection regimes, protecting the systems that would allow users to work in this type of space safely. So if we were to take a look at Malaysia's data protection regimes, there are actually two different types. The first is actually for the private and commercial sector. So this is actually under the Personal Data Protection Act 2010 that states that data management should be in line with the 7 principles of data protection. While the second type of data protection regime concerns the type of regime that is supposed to be adhered to by the government. And this actually differs from the commercial sector due to the classifications that's actually identified in OSA 1972. So the Malaysian Public Sector Management of Information and Communications Technology Security Handbook actually articulates the type of information classification for the government, which are graded into 4 classifications: top secret, secret, confidential, and restricted. So the classifications are elaborated further in preparation for adopting cloud technology, where a 5th classification, public, allows data to actually be placed in cloud. So if we were to move to the next one, to the next slide, please. So if we were moving the discussion a little bit further, and we're actually taking a look at data localization policies, under the PDPA, data localization requirements are actually not imposed. And PDPA does not necessarily speak heavily on cross-border data flows, except it actually does state that transfers to third countries should only be possible if the country is approved or whitelisted. However, conversations with in the roundtable that was held, the potential updates to PDPA actually proposes a blacklist approach instead, which could address differences in data management or concerns of data management practices in other countries, should the other countries actually not meet the standards that Malaysia actually requires for our cybersecurity. The second type of data localization or cross-border data flows policy there is actually in regards to the government approach when it comes to some of the ways of data management. And the government has actually decided to take a data residency approach, where the department opting for cloud computing should actually know the source of origin for the cloud computing services. It should be noted, however, that government departments are encouraged to actually refer to data sovereignty principles, where they would actually have to know the legal requirements and jurisdiction of where the data will physically reside. The data sovereignty considerations are to identify the data management and stakeholders in the relevant departments, the data security, physical, geographical location and residency of the data, the rules, procedures and laws, security risk, data classification, ownership of data, as well as the data flows. So some of these actually would determine some of the policies that we would actually see when the government is actually trying to manage their own modernization of systems. So moving to the next slide, if it's okay. There are some challenges when we actually took a look at data protection in Malaysia. So the first is the harmonization of data governance, where there are actually differences in the range of laws that a business would actually have to adhere to if they were to actually offer such services, or even offer any type of services that requires data collection, data processing. And these are such things as the GDPR, to standards for cybersecurity, such as ISO compliance. And this the fact that there are actually many different types of processes can actually be quite confusing, and it should be difficult in the process, in a journey of a business when they're actually trying to digitize, especially if we're actually looking at the SME heavy landscape that Malaysia has. So the second point actually looks at it was raised that smaller players may actually not be able to afford heavy cybersecurity costs. Therefore, PDPD has to consider the capacity and capability of smaller players to meet the minimum compliance for data management and cybersecurity. It can be noted that countries in ASEAN and APAC are actually attempting to raise adequacy levels to encourage while securing cross-border data flows. So there are actually regional frameworks to offer some types of guidance, such as the ASEAN Data Management Framework and APAC Cross-Border Privacy Enforcement Arrangement. However, this would concern the digitization process of the different types of industrial landscape that a country has, and Malaysia actually having an SME heavy landscape with sometimes operate a business that's actually operated by by two individuals may actually find it a bit difficult if there are certain types of regulations require someone to actually be thoroughly in charge of data protection. So we all know that PDPA is actually under reviews for updates, and there are actually conversations of the amendment of the PDPA, and the updated PDPA will actually we would actually expect that they would actually have challenges in implementation, because among some of the new elements is the appointment of data protection officers, mandatory data breach notifications, and some of these would actually, if it is standardized, it would actually have to be implemented across the board to anyone who would actually collect and process data. And in Malaysia's SME heavy landscape, this can be among the challenges as cited earlier. Other types of PDPA updates that was actually spoken about in the roundtable is about the ease of data portability, heavier obligations for major data processors to safeguard data, and to pursue a blacklist approach to cross-border data management, as mentioned earlier. The mechanisms for the implementation of an updated PDPA can vary and would actually require a multi-stakeholder approach to ensure that the levels of awareness as well as technical adoption and the understanding of regulations is kept, is actually distributed. Yes. So moving on to the next one. So this is actually a continuation of the same section. We find that it was actually raised in the roundtable that the absence of data breach notifications actually does shape Malaysia's awareness and good data hygiene. So as mentioned earlier, there's a number of data breaches that would actually be reported, and these are actually reported and they are allegedly linked to specific incidences. Most of the time, data breach notifications are actually not publicized. However, it may actually be necessary for Malaysia to consider publicizing data breach investigations. In other words, the process of it from the start to the finish, so that there is actually an understanding of the responsibility of the players who are responsible for for how it occurred, what happened, and to actually ensure that the enforcement mechanism can weigh the responsibilities quite appropriately, because some of the coverage or some of the coverage or data breaches that we actually do find would actually report that a data breach has occurred or hacking has occurred, and this actually may not be a necessarily effective public awareness approach, especially if a term such as hacking may actually not describe some of the data breaches, like perhaps phishing exercises or even vulnerabilities in API. That would actually speak about very different technical situations that actually happen in the background. So moving forward to the next slide. So over here, we have actually attempted to actually take a look at some of the preparedness for digital agreements, because as mentioned earlier, as Malaysia actually digitized, and as we actually would like to open Malaysia's digital economy for greater activity, there would actually be this interest to take a look at digital economic partnerships agreements and some of how Malaysia could participate more in international digital economy. So here, I think some of our findings is that Malaysia does have compatible agencies with the jurisdiction to engage in DEA spaces. So for some of the examples that we have taken a look at, for instance, like the Singapore Australia Digital Economic Partnership Agreement, or the CPTPP, Malaysia actually does have the agencies who would actually be responsible in these places. So among them, we actually do have MCMC for telecommunications, internet services, as well as online content problems. The Personal Data Protection Department under the Ministry of Communications and Multimedia, Malaysia's mandate is to regulate and the processing of personal data of individual users. Further is the Royal Malaysia Police, whose jurisdiction include fraud, finance, and trade issues, identity theft and hacking, and the Ministry of Domestic Trade, Cooperatives, and Consumerism, who will look into intellectual property and copyright matters. So just trying to actually dipping our toes a little into possible harmonizations of these principles. With international principles, we actually did try to take a look at Australia, Malaysia, when it comes to privacy principles, for instance. And we actually did notice that Australia actually highlights 13 privacy principles, while Malaysia has 7 principles for personal data protection. And some of the differences can actually be Australia's privacy principles on open and transparent management of personal information, principles on anonymity and pseudonymity, dealing with unsolicited personal information, and as well as principles for direct marketing. So I believe this is actually the end of this section. I will actually pass the floor over to Dr. Juwita for the policy recommendations, and I look forward to the questions and answers later.
Yeah, I will. Thank you, Farina. I will cover the policy recommendations for the taxing the digital economy component, and then I'll pass the floor back to you. So in our report, we did see that transparency and introduction of taxes related to the digital economy would be one of the biggest challenges. So as one of the biggest concerns in Malaysia is the planning and introduction of new forms of taxes for the digital economy and also digital trade activities. We find that it's important that impact assessments of such measures are taken into account, looking at the feedback and also input from stakeholders that are affected. So such policies and clear guidelines of implementation would provide ease of doing business for not just local firms, but also international companies doing business here in Malaysia. So looking at the challenges again, capacity building is something that is key to create a sustainable digital taxation framework. So as mentioned before, due to the difficulty and complex nature of taxing the digital economy, with the boom of digital trade activities, we find that building local capacity and know-how is key. Capacity building exercises and also training sessions may take place with collaborations with neighboring countries like Singapore or Australia, who have developed a somewhat robust framework in the wake of their own digital economies, nurturing their digital economies domestically or via digital free trade zones or digital economic agreements. On the cybersecurity policy recommendations, Farlina, could you elaborate on this, please?
Sure. That would actually be to, so some of the conversations that we've actually had, especially in these spaces, is about harmonization. I think that's where the standardization efforts for cybersecurity was actually proposed or suggested in the roundtables, because if there are a certain type of standardized efforts for cybersecurity, standardized approach, even some that could actually adopt some forms of the ISO standards, this would actually ease compliance. Should higher standards of cybersecurity be mandatory for SME practitioners? It was actually suggested that maybe diluted forms of the ISO standards can be pursued by government bodies, organizations, agencies such as Cybersecurity Malaysia and Syrian, who could actually take a look at some of these areas to just increase the cyber security capacity in among the SMEs. If it's possible to go to the next slide. So another suggestion is for the cybersecurity agencies to actually consider increased transparency in data breach investigations. We actually touched a little bit on this earlier, where the PDPD should seek to publicize its investigation activities, including the outcomes of said investigations. So some things that actually do occur, there are actually investigations that's actually being made. However, the process actually is triggered by some of by reports that's actually either made through social media, or it's actually some of the news that has actually carried some of these data breaches. Then it would actually trigger data breach investigations. Should the PDPA actually be updated where data breach notifications is mandatory, they would actually be given up to say 72 hours for some of the data breach notifications to be made, if I'm actually not mistaken. So however, if the investigation is actually done in darkness, the process of understanding the responsibility and building a greater trust in the justice system may actually not be built. And this would actually impact the public awareness on the necessary cyber hygiene that's actually needed for data breaches. So it would actually be a consideration for cybersecurity agencies to increase transparency in data breach investigation. The second one is actually on embarking on digital economic partnerships should actually stimulate the digital economy and build a rules-based environment for cyber and digital taxation framework. So some of these would actually suggest Malaysia embarking on addressing competing and conflicting standards that actually does impact the modernization of Malaysia's industries. While DEAs are actually intended to open Malaysia for digital economic in activities, such partnerships can actually also be seen as platforms to build conversations on rules and standards. Thus, these types of engagements, especially if you're actually looking at new frontier types of technologies like artificial intelligence or different types of data innovations, these would require, as people are actually adopting these technologies, they're actually also writing the rules and standards of the devices or of the digital materials. So these engagements should actually ensure that Malaysia's national interests are protected and industries promoted. However, this would actually also concern some of the capacities and capabilities of the agencies, because some parts of, say, the digital economy agreement between Australia and Singapore, they actually take a look at very specific types of obligations, such as the obligations for the expeditious and efficient installation, maintenance, and repair of submarine telecommunications cable systems, or the digital agreement obligations under the CPP, which would actually include online consumer protection, personal information protection, compliance with requests of source codes for investigation, enforcement for investigation, enforcement, or judicial purposes, and to adopt measures to reduce or prevent unsolicited commercial electronic messages. So in some ways, Malaysia is actually heading in the direction where the DEAs would actually be something that is highly attainable. In the current state, there are actually certain preparations that would actually probably needs to be done, particularly in capacity building. Just turning the floor back to Dr. Juwita to actually close the session, and I look forward to the questions and answers.
Thank you so much, Farlina. I would like to invite our two esteemed discussants to the floor. Let me make a brief introduction of our two discussants. I would like to welcome Mr. Senturan Elalingam, who is an indirect tax and tax technology partner based here in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. I just found out that he's Australian as well. He currently leads the tax technology consulting practice in Malaysia, which supports clients with respect to tax transformation and tax innovation. He has advised clients on indirect tax matters for over 18 years in Malaysia, China, the Middle East, and also Australia. Welcome, Sen. I'm joined here as well by Puan Adila Junaid, who is again based here in Malaysia. Adila is the Director of Legal and Government Affairs at Microsoft Malaysia. As part of the corporate, external, and legal affairs team, she is an advisor to Microsoft for government and policy, public policy issues that impact innovation and growth of the information technology sector. Thank you so much both for coming and hopefully to be able to give criticisms on our report. And let me just start off first with Sen. Looking at your expertise and looking at your experience with businesses, guiding businesses on indirect taxes, I was wondering, and I would like to ask what your take is on the current taxation framework in Malaysia, looking at both the direct and also indirect taxes related to the e-commerce and also digital trade activities. Sen, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Doctor. In terms of the tax framework, most of these tax laws were enacted a long time ago when we had bricks and mortar businesses, and they didn't really contemplate the kind of environment that we have now, where customers are located in one tax jurisdiction and you've got businesses located in another, and goods and services are being sort of transacted remotely. And so a lot of the tax systems are not really, let's just say, they're not set up to sort of capture that in the most effective way. What the OECD has done is, certainly around indirect tax, has made a lot of recommendations as part of BEPS around indirect taxes, how that can be improved. They even released a toolkit for Asia PAC last year to guide jurisdictions on how they should tax these types of activities. What we've seen Malaysia do in the two things that you've mentioned, one on the service tax on digital services, which started in 2020, and the implementation of the sales tax rules, which was going to start 1 January, but now has been deferred to 1 April next year. Both of these are consistent with what the OECD has recommended and is intended to close loopholes. So it's very common in terms of these practices have been adopted by a lot of the other countries in the region. So around digital services, most of the Asia PAC countries have implemented it. Low value goods, we've seen Singapore is going to implement it next year. Australia and New Zealand have done it. So a lot of countries are following through. So Malaysia's policies around indirect tax is very much consistent with what everyone else is doing. The one key difference, though, is that we, unlike any of these other countries, do not have a GST or a VAT system. And so we are trying to do this with sort of a homespun tax system we have, which is sales tax and service tax. And that has created some very unique and different outcomes. So Malaysia is a bit out of step with everyone whilst we have these other taxes. And we're trying to sort of bring in a global policy into our localized tax regime, which I think has created some problems for these global e-commerce providers, digital economy providers, and also some local providers, the tax authorities, and even us tax consultants around administering it, because we're trying to, let's just say, get us a round peg into a square hole or vice versa. But by and large, the indirect tax side, I think, is fairly consistent. On the direct tax side, I think, as you mentioned, that there is a guide that IRB have released that sort of tries to broaden the scope of or at least try and define what electronic services are, and seems is geared towards capturing that sort of any kind of business activity that's conducted in Malaysia. So that provides some clarity. The other area where we see the digital economy taxes is around royalties and withholding tax. So there's been a lot of confusion around that going back for a while now, whether you buy software and whether that's subject to withholding tax or not. The IRB is of the opinion it is, but there's still a lot of confusion there. And so that's an area that continues to be debated. And one final point, I guess, is that we've seen the Pillar 1 implementation coming up soon, the global minimum tax. It remains to be seen what changes we may see in the near future around that as well. So yeah, I think that's sort of general commentary around what we sort of see the tax environment being.
Thank you, Sen. So Puan Adila, let's try to weave the two components of the digital economy here. What are your initial thoughts on the findings, may it be on the taxation framework or even the cybersecurity component of the report?
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Juwita. And firstly, congratulations to you and your team on this report. It's definitely very timely. And I think there really is right now a need for the country to address some of the foundational issues of policy and regulation to really sort of benefit from digital technologies and the digital economy and trade as an element to enhance the national competitiveness and establish our position in the global economy, right? So in particular, so I think I'll leave a commentary on tax to the esteemed Sen. And I do have some thoughts on the recommendations on the cybersecurity side. I appreciate in particular the recommendation to have cybersecurity laws and policies in line with international norms and recognizing economic partnerships as a way to perhaps have constructive engagement with partners to jointly develop an appropriate ecosystem to enable sort of digital trade. One thing that I wanted to maybe talk about is I recognize and appreciate the difference drawn between data protection in the private sector and how governments view the need to protect data, right? And I think there could be scope for further work to look into this. What I believe is an understanding on the government part, which is not uncommon, that security is equated to the locality of where your physical infrastructure is. So I think this is a not uncommon way of thinking, but I think in this day and age, in particular, recognizing the transformational technologies that are available in hyperscale cloud providers, for example, it would be good if we could move along from that equating local physical location to security and control. So for example, in relation to cybersecurity, a hyperscale provider such as Microsoft, for example, invests huge amounts of money. So I think it was like $20 billion US over 5 years to develop cybersecurity. The security signals that we receive and the threat intelligence that we have and that private sector players in general have really, I would say, offer a different level of security compared to merely having physical location in a specific jurisdiction. So yeah, I would very much also appreciate, I think, Falina's observation that this also is related to how the government itself, in providing services that are digitalized to support digital trade and the digital economy, could well think about that view on equating localization to greater security. I think the other observation that I wanted to speak to was the finding that I think SMEs found cybersecurity practices expensive, or maybe the costs might be prohibitive. So yeah, I completely recognize that this might be a sort of common sentiment, but I think one of the key things we can do, in addition to having potentially more flexible approaches to cybersecurity requirements, is having greater awareness and education among the business community that as you digitalize, cybersecurity is the same as what physical security would be in your traditional business. So it's not an additional esoteric special thing being imposed on you by some esoteric regulator. It's part of ensuring that your business, as you digitalize, is secure. It's like locking your warehouse. So I think most SMEs, if they understood that when they do business digitally, cybersecurity is the same as any other security for your business. It's what keeps you resilient and what keeps your business and the value, protects the value of your business, that hopefully might change the perception of cybersecurity. Treat it more as a business risk rather than a regulatory obligation. And I mean, to kind of tie in with that, I think research that we've done shows that really 98% of threats are addressed by basic cybersecurity hygiene. So it's not anything fancy. It's don't share your password, don't, yeah, things like that. Awareness and the willingness to drive that throughout the organization in an SME. I think one more thing I wanted to mention about was on the breach notifications. So yeah, I also think that that is something that I believe should be in the works, that mandatory breach notification. But I think over and above having sort of public awareness and transparency on what happens, I think it's important that notifications enable the parties to improve responses and improve security. So the elements of what needs to be reported and tracked need to be sufficient to enable the parties to improve their responses. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Adila. Before I turn the floor back, give the floor back to Sen, may I invite the online audience to deposit your questions in the Q&A box so that our co-moderator Imran can also include those questions in the Q&A coming up soon. So Sen, going back to you, in your experience dealing with businesses on the ground, what are the main challenges that you see when it comes to business conforming to the different taxation measures related to the digital economy and digital trade activities? The floor is yours.
Okay, thanks. I think, in terms of the Malaysian experience, it is largely, again, a lot of it's caused by us having a very different tax system to everyone else. And so that's posed some very unique challenges. So you have these global tech companies who are, as I said, implementing a lot of these jurisdictions globally are implementing these rules. So they have to adopt similar practices everywhere. So in majority of jurisdictions, virtually all of them, they only tax retail transactions, B2C. Malaysia is one of 3 jurisdictions in the world, South Africa, Russia, the other 2, that tax B2B transactions. And the reason why we do that is because of our unique system. And when we went down that way, what we didn't anticipate was how broad that meant. So a lot of commercial transactions got brought into the scope. A lot of, whether it was related companies, holding companies, regional headquarters, potentially were brought in scope. And then that needed a lot of consultation after the tax was introduced to then carve these people out. And so there's a lot of complexities because of the differences in our tax system. The other thing was a lot of things had to be negotiated outcomes around operational stuff. As you can imagine, these global providers, they would issue, they had one invoice template that they would issue to all customers everywhere, or they may not issue an invoice at all. So it's very hard for them to say if Malaysia has specific conditions for them to cater or tweak their systems just for Malaysia. And so some of those operational challenges, I think we saw with the digital services one that was introduced in 2020, and we're seeing that again with sales tax, the sales tax amendment, which is going to happen next year. Just around, how we're going to be able to issue an invoice, what kind of documents do we need? Can we really get that done in 3 months or 2 months that you need us to get it done? So this has been some of the, there's been some technical challenges, operational challenges on the indirect tax side. On the direct tax side, again, I think the key issue has really been what we've seen with clients has been around the software issue. Is it a royalty? Is it not? Do we need to withhold? Do we not? I think that's been a long-running issue in Malaysia, but I think those are, that's been, the real key issues that we've seen.
Thank you so much, Sen. It seems that it is an overarching issue here when it comes to the discrepancy in different taxation measures between Malaysia and also its trading partners. And just to highlight to the audience that this was exactly what we gathered from the stakeholders engagement, that this was one of the biggest challenges in terms of taxing the digital economy. Before I go back to Adila, I think Farlina would like to address some of the statements that were made before by Adila. Go ahead, Farlina.
Thank you so much for the comments. And actually, I would actually say the comment is actually basically my response is actually basically I'm in agreement of what you've actually mentioned, particularly when you actually associated the security with physical infrastructure. I mean, it's like the thing is, because there are various considerations, I think even if somebody would actually think that just because you actually have the physical infrastructure there, or it's actually within jurisdiction, that would actually be the safest it is, because a part of cybersecurity is about the process, it is about the technology, it's about ensuring that you have the capability to actually protect these places. So even if it's actually in Malaysia, but you actually do have different types of different levels of cybersecurity, even awareness practices and things like that, it may not necessarily be equivalent to physical protection. And I think something that was raised that I actually just wanted to throw in, that it's I think reported, it was actually by Microsoft about the defense threat report in relations to what happens actually in Ukraine, the Ukraine-Russia situation, when you're actually taking a look at the computing services that actually has to be provided by government, even in times of crisis, means that if your territory is actually under a certain type of threat, that would actually be problematic if you actually have your physical infrastructure, if you're actually placing all your baskets in one infrastructure or several infrastructures within your own territory. So that actually is a bit more complicated. I think when we actually have to think about cyber, it is actually an interconnected environment. And I think that's one of the reasons why, for instance, when we're looking at some aspects of the national cybersecurity policies in the past, even the PDPA, these would try to take a look at data, I think data residency approaches. And I think it is quite open to data flows or data actually being stored abroad, and hence the reasoning for some of the cloud policies actually stating you actually have to know the source of origins, or at least the exact cybersecurity standards throughout the data's life cycle. However, because I suspect because of strategic thinking and the thinking that if you actually have your, when you actually think about sovereignty, it's actually equivalent to territorial borders. That's actually why people actually immediately go, okay, if it's security, then it's jurisdiction. Jurisdiction is actually equivalent to of the physical. I have to see it, I have to touch it. If I actually want to call anything from it, it actually has to come to me. So that's actually the idea, I think, for just increased jurisdiction control. That's where I think international engagement is actually probably quite important for this, because as the digital economy would actually be global, and I think as long as it's global, the conversations for standards would actually be global. You would actually need the data flows to flow. So that would actually just be very initial thoughts about that. And I actually love the idea about about your digital security should actually be equivalent to your physical security. You would actually put a lock on your door, and you would actually need to actually think about insuring your services if you're actually using a lot of digital services. I think one of the challenges that PDPD actually faces is that you actually have your industries or your companies that's actually highly in the digital sector, but you would actually have someone, a smaller company whose main trade is actually probably not e-commerce, but they're actually still doing data collection regardless. And they would, because the information, my name would actually still be the same if I do e-commerce as my name would actually be the same if I'm actually just like buying something from a mom and pop store or something like that. So this, I think the level, the interest, the burden for investment actually becomes higher if it's actually some of these mom and pop stores. But that's actually also the mindset when it comes to cybersecurity, I think. So just putting it out there, although I suspect then the burden would actually be on us to actually do these types of more research on different types of businesses and interest in cybersecurity risk and things like this. So just some thoughts. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Farlina. So Adila, looking at my digital blueprint and looking at it, cybersecurity is one of the pillars that Malaysia needs to work on to strengthen the digital economy framework. So along those lines, how can Malaysia position itself as a cybersecurity hub for the region to support the growth of the digital economy?
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Dr. Junita, and thank you very much, Farlina, as well for your responses. Actually look forward to perhaps working further together on some of these questions. That would be great. Back to your question, Dr. Juwita, about Malaysia as a cybersecurity hub, right? So I actually think this is a fantastic opportunity. So Malaysia does have a lot of things going for it. I think in one of the recent, well, first of all, there are a lot of cybersecurity indices, some of which Malaysia doesn't appear to do so well, and some of which they do. So I think in an ITU index, I think that assessed things like laws and strategies, Malaysia appeared quite high. So that's one positive. And I think beyond that, there's recognition at a national policymaking level, right? That, for example, under the Malaysia Digital Economy Blueprint, I think one of the targets for the end phases is to become a regional market producer for digital products and a digital solutions provider, recognizing that like highly skilled talent in these areas, such as cybersecurity, could be a real opportunity for Malaysia to sort of make its mark in the digital economy, right? So I think one of the target outcomes in the Malaysia Digital Economy Blueprint, for example, is to have 20,000 cybersecurity knowledge workers by, I think it was 2025, that's right. So I think this really is a good start. Having the intent and having sort of recognition that our starting point is not bad. And the efforts that I understand to be in the works, I think are the next step. So I do understand that under the Malaysia cybersecurity strategy that we have, which is 2020 to 2024, one of the things they were looking at was enhancing and strengthening the legislative framework and enforcement capabilities. So that I think goes to everything that you've mentioned in your recommendations as well. So making sure that our national laws and governance structure for cybersecurity monitoring and enforcement is basically up to an international sort of recognized level of good practice. So with that, and I think a lot of investment in skilling. So there are a lot of academic institutions and government agencies that recognize the importance of skilling for a digital era, and cybersecurity does take prominence in those. So I think those are really key components that at least we have the intention and the institutional infrastructure to start. So really, I think it all boils down to the implementation, as with most things, implementation of those intentions. And I think we're in good stead. Yeah, I mean, one of the other things, apart from just individuals, right? I think the cybersecurity strategy also states that potentially looking at cybersecurity as a product, right? As our SMEs and entrepreneurs looking into cybersecurity solutions as being an area of economic activity for us to focus on. So I really would love to see that happen. Yeah.
Thank you, Adila. Going back to you, Sen, I know you've been working with businesses for a long time, and then talking about taxes is not maybe such a positive word in the business world, but given our limitations in broadening the tax base, looking from the business perspectives, what do you think are the benefits in general in taxing the digital economy and also the e-commerce activities?
Okay, I think, you know, from a business perspective, certainly global and you know, multinational businesses, I think they just want consistency across jurisdictions and comparability. So I think the fact that you know, they you know, wherever they conduct business, they just want, you know, to be able to you know, operate in a very similar way and not have you know, specific or unique or quirky rules for one country compared to another, because that incurs significant costs. I don't think, you know, in terms of any of the participants in this industry or in the sector, you know, are against being taxed. I think, you know, they understand that you know, you want to have a level playing field, and everyone should pay their fair amount of tax. So I think in that sense, you know, the following OECD recommendations, and they're adopting these rules, and wherever a country announces it, we are seeing the larger players implement and participate in the tax system. It's really more, yeah. So in terms of the benefits, I think from Malaysia adopting these rules, I think it is the right thing to do, and it's consistent with global practice. I think the issues that we need to address is really making sure that whatever we adopt is consistent with global practice, and so that it doesn't make it harder for businesses to apply here.
Thank you, Sen. I do agree with you, because as Malaysia is a developed country and we are in so many different free trade agreements that are of higher standard with clauses and provisions on e-commerce, for example, with the CPTPP and even the RCEP, there needs to be some sort of standardization so that there will be the component or the index of ease of doing business can be improved upon the medium to long term. I totally agree with you. Going back to Adila. So again, we were talking about CPTPP. We're talking about as well, Farlina mentioned on the digital economy agreements as well. A question for you: is Malaysia ready to embark on such partnerships, on such free trade agreements with other countries, especially given our cybersecurity standards and also existing data localization policies and data transfer policies as well. Back to you.
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. That's a great question. And I don't presuppose that we have to be 100% able to comply with what our intention would be entering into such agreements. So, the recent CPTPP ratification is a good sign. Our membership in the IPEF. And I think also relatively recently, we agreed to enter some framework cooperation agreement on digital economy with Singapore. Those sorts of things, I think, demonstrate that we have the intention to enable our ecosystem to be compatible with these digital trade arrangements. So in terms of the nuts and bolts of making sure our regulatory framework and our institutions are in place, I would say that, it's a work in progress, and we've had some ups and downs getting to where we might need to be. And I really liked the idea, I think, that you've proposed in your report, that entering into these agreements are part of the journey towards being ready, rather than we have to be ready before we enter into these things. Jointly developing the right standards and jointly agreeing on what the right standards are would be a great outcome of entering into these agreements. So, I hope that's something that could happen. Yeah.
Thank you, Adila. As someone who has been following the progress on IPEF as well, we do look forward to entering such binding, hopefully, agreements so that it will mold our local institutions for further reforms that will make Malaysia more competitive in the global space.